right, now we'll get right into today's session. Our speaker today is Jennifer Blesh. Dr. Jennifer Blesh is an agroecologist and associate professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. She conducts ecological and interdisciplinary research to understand the outcomes of different cropping systems and management practices. Her work focuses on increasing crop diversity, including identifying how cover crops and perennials affect soil health and nutrient cycling processes, especially legume nitrogen fixation. She also studies social processes that lead to food system transformation. From her production through consumption, prior to her current position, she held appointments at the Federal University of Mato Grosso in Brazil, as well as Cornell University. Jennifer, please go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Bess, and for the land acknowledgement. Thanks to the NFU and to Darren for the kind invitation. I really admire the work that you all do. And I'm pleased to get to share some of my work with you today. And I really look forward to learning more about you in the discussion. And so given the tight schedule, the packed schedule we have for today, I'm going to jump right in. I was asked to speak on 3 really big questions, and we'll see how far we get on these. So I'm going to focus on defining agroecology, thinking about how it might work or how it might look in North America, and then can it reduce emissions? Okay. So there are many definitions of agroecology. This is a common one that you may be familiar with. Agroecology is a field of science, a productive practice, and a social movement transforming food systems towards sustainability. This is an evolving concept. It actually has many definitions and perspectives. My training is mostly in ecology. I conduct a lot of my research on farms in the US Midwest. So in the North American context, I think the science and practice elements have been most prominent, but all 3 dimensions are certainly present. And I'll say more about each of these 3, starting with the history of the term. So the term, or the word agroecology, has the longest history as a science. It emerged around the same time as the development of the ecosystem concept in the early 1930s. This is a term that was coined, ecosystem, was coined by Arthur Tansley. He was a British plant scientist who was a pioneer in the field of ecology. And it was later popularized by Eugene Odum about 60 years ago. So as scientists, one of the main roles that we have is conducting research and publishing findings. So you can analyze publications as one way to understand the history of a field. So in this paper on the history of agroecology as a science, the authors show the term popping up in the 1930s, its expansion in the 70s and 80s, and then that it really took off in the 1990s. And it was also then that the definition expanded more to focus on social movements and practices, which I'll get to in a minute. Part of that increased interest in the field in the 80s and 90s is because ecologists had been documenting the consequences of industrial agriculture, like soil erosion, pollution of waterways, biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions. So agroecological research focused on developing ecological understanding of how farms work and the effects of management practices on surrounding environments. So as a scientific discipline, agroecologists tracked these consequences, and we're also working to figure out how to increase the sustainability of farms or agroecosystems. So agroecosystems, like all ecosystems, are driven by ecological processes. And agroecology works to understand those processes and develop practices that harness those natural functions while reducing the use of practices that undermine them. So building on studies of unmanaged systems like forests, key principles relevant to agroecology are listed here. Diversity above and below ground and animal diversity that leads to checks and balances in function, including being self-regulating. For instance, severe diseases or pest outbreaks would be uncommon. And they're resilient, right? They can recover and persist after disturbances or stress, like extreme weather events. They're efficient. They cycle energy, nutrients, water, and carbon with little to no waste. So one organism's waste is another organism's resource. And finally, they're mostly self-sufficient with external inputs of just sunlight, rain, air, and biological nitrogen fixation. So agroecology applies these principles to think about designing and managing more sustainable food systems. And more specifically, I want to just share a few examples of ecological concepts that are applied to understand and manage farm ecosystems. And the first is the ecosystem concept. I've already used this term, but I'll define it. Ecosystems are bounded systems that have relationships between living things and between living and non-living organisms, or between living and non-living things. There are flows of energy and matter into and out of ecosystems. So on a farm, there might be inputs like sunlight and fertilizer and outputs of harvested crops and animal products. The second concept is trophic interactions. So these are feeding relationships between organisms. As an example, ladybugs consume pests like soybean aphids, or decomposers feed on organic matter to cycle nutrients. A third concept that's been important in agroecology is species interactions. These can include competition, for example, determining how to manage a crop to outcompete weeds or other pests, or facilitation, like mycorrhizal fungi, which increase a crop's access to water and nutrients. And then finally, the succession concept shows how ecosystem processes and functions change over hundreds of years as plant communities shift from mostly annuals to more perennial species. And this concept has been important to understanding how agroecosystems function, because a lot of farms are maintained in an early state of succession, right? Because there's frequent tillage and rotations of just annuals. So as a science, just to summarize this section, agroecology draws on a lot of different disciplines: ecology, agronomy, weed science, soil science, plant pathology, many others, to understand how what we might call the structure or the characteristics of farms influence their function. Things like yield, nutritional quality, nutrient balances, soil carbon storage. And of course, there are feedbacks between these things. So this structure-function relationship is strongly influenced by farm management. And some aspects of a farm ecosystem are directly controlled by management. For instance, a key focus of agroecology is understanding how crop and livestock diversity that's selected by farmers and the associated diversity that goes along with it can lead to positive interactions and outcomes. Some aspects like climate or soil type, or even maybe landscape diversity, are not directly influenced by management, or they're not easy to change at the individual level. And of course, management decisions are part of a much broader social and political context, which this field also tackles. So this leads me to the second part of the definition. What does agroecology look like on real farms? And this is where, as you might expect, the literature gets a bit more diverse, but I'll share some thoughts from my perspective. This point to me is really important, so I'm going to say it again. All farms are agroecosystems. They're subject to ecological processes in the Earth system. So we can study any farm, regardless of its practices, through this lens of agroecology. For example, we learned about drivers of global pollution by studying large-scale monocultures. But the field of agroecology has also been tightly linked to agroecology as a practice, because another main goal of research is to figure out how to develop more sustainable farms. And the management systems on farms vary in a lot of different ways. This diagram distills those dimensions. So there's a continuum of soil disturbance levels through tillage and other operations. There are ranges of crop and livestock diversity. And there's differing levels of dependence on synthetic inputs. And together, these are the three primary aspects of management that shape what I showed, a farm's structure and function. And generally, what we would call agroecological practices fall at this end of the spectrum, right? Because these practices are based on the principles that I introduced just a minute ago: increasing diversity, recycling nutrients and waste, and building resilience. So a key point is that agroecological practices are about applying principles that are adapted to different places and contexts. It's not just a recipe, not just a list of practices. And so to illustrate that, here are just some images of example agroecological practices in the North American context at different scales. They might be certified organic production, especially with reduced external input use, cover cropping and intercropping, like these clover pathways here, building overall soil health through reduced soil disturbance and greater plant diversity. Might be diverse urban agriculture, permaculture, food forests, other agroforestry practices, management intensive rotational grazing, use of diverse cover crop mixtures. I also have a picture on the bottom right of perennial grain crops, which are maybe the most futuristic thing in this image. They're not yet widely available or high yielding, but they're certainly a promising future option for restoring ecosystems. And innovations in practices like these are often first developed by farmers, right, including indigenous practices. And agroecologists often do on-farm research, participatory research with farmers with horizontal flows of knowledge. What is maybe new, at least from my perspective as an ecologist, is the application of knowledge from ecological science to understand how ecosystems work and figure out how to improve their sustainability, especially in the current context of global change. And so I'm going to finish the definition of agroecology quickly, and then provide some examples from our research on farms in the US Midwest, studying the ecological functions of some of these practices. So of course I have to mention, especially in the context of the NFU, that agroecology is also linked to a broader food sovereignty movement, which supports the right of all people to healthy, culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound methods. In regions like Latin America, agroecology emerged from a social movement perspective that seeks to revive traditional knowledge and practices and seeks the right for people to define their own food systems. And of course, the NFU is a member of one of the main organizations promoting this concept, La Via Campesina. So I won't dive into this aspect a lot today, but I'd love to hear more in the discussion from all of you. Generally, in Canada and the US, the development of agroecology has been a science-based movement that seeks to counter policies, corporate concentration, and practices that prioritize yield over broader goals that we might want from farming. And this trend has also been connected with rapidly growing interest in healthy, local, sustainable food, and with movements for food justice in urban environments. Even if they've been less of a focus here, indigenous production practices are certainly important to agroecology in North America as a rich source of knowledge, and also because there's a need to address historical and current threats to indigenous peoples and traditions. So agroecology as a movement encourages new narratives, new ways of thinking about farming, not just systems thinking like I presented, but also recognizing our relationship as part of nature. So many indigenous knowledge systems don't have this problematic nature-human divide of Western thought. And so we need to think about how agriculture can support both nature and food production, recognizing that we are part of nature. So building from this three-part definition, what does agroecology look like in the US and Canada? And I'll start by sharing some research findings from our work on farms in the US as an example of how agroecology integrates science and practice. A central research question in agroecology is listed here. Can diversification of farms increase multiple benefits, including crop production, while reducing the environmental harms of industrial agriculture? So I'm going to focus on some examples related to crop rotation diversity with a focus on cover crops, which I think are a nice illustration of old ideas blended with new scientific knowledge. So one key finding is that the positive effects of diversity are especially strong when what we call functional diversity increases in a cropping system. And what that means is growing crops or plants that have different traits that contrast and that complement each other. So annuals and perennials, legumes and grasses and brassicas, et cetera, harvested and non-harvested crops. Functional diversity can also include recoupling crop and livestock production, right? So either on a farm or within a region. So rotations can include more perennial forages, and manure nutrients can be recycled, closing loops. And this type of diversity promotes interactions between species that lead to greater overall capture of resources like light, water, soil nutrients, and in many cases, this results in increases in yield and soil health. Here's one example. So functional diversity can build soil carbon. This figure is a synthesis of all studies that compared more diverse grain rotations to monocultures of corn or corn soy rotations to ask how rotations affect soil carbon. We only included data from studies that were at least 5 years long because it takes time to detect changes in total soil organic matter. And many of these data are from long-term experiments, cropping systems studies that have been in place for 10 to 30 years. And what we found is that rotations with cover crops, which were not harvested in this case, built soil carbon by 6% on average, and rotations with perennials like forages built soil organic carbon by 12% on average. Corn soybean rotations or other rotations that just had a harvested legume actually led to slight declines in soil carbon compared to continuous corn because they produce less biomass, even though we know rotations provide benefits for other things like yield or disease control. But the take-home message here is that perennials and cover crops, two important types of functional diversity, increase soil carbon in fields. And thinking about how this works, both the quality and the quantity of the plant material going into soil is important. And maximizing the presence of roots in a field is especially beneficial. This is an image from the Land Institute showing a perennial grain, intermediate wheatgrass on the right, compared to annual winter wheat on the left over time. You can see that the perennial crop has a lot more root biomass than the annual. It's quite impressive. And these roots provide carbon to the soil more continuously, and they build organic matter through complex interactions between roots, the microbial community, and soil minerals. High yielding perennial grains are still often the future, but there are many other ways to increase roots in fields and perennialize a farmer rotation. There could be, agroforestry is one that I mentioned earlier, but in the context of a grain farm, maybe planting overwintering non-harvested cover crops in the off season, or by including perennials like hay and forage in rotation with annuals. These fine scale processes and interactions in the soil are currently a really exciting knowledge frontier in the ecology world and soil science. Practices that increase crop diversity and build organic matter support complex interactions in the soil ecosystem that provide really important functions. So when plants fix carbon through photosynthesis, a portion of that carbon enters the soil through their roots, providing energy for microbial activity and supporting a diverse soil food web that makes the rhizosphere a zone of intense nutrient cycling. The rhizosphere is this gradient along plant roots where roots and soil organisms interact very tightly. There are also important symbiotic relationships to promote in farms. like legumes, which partner with bacteria that fix nitrogen, and mycorrhizal fungi that associate with many plants, including corn. And these relationships are fundamental to sustainability and resilience by supporting nutrient cycling, disease control, promoting plant growth and health, all of which can reduce the need for purchased inputs and reduce some of the consequences of simplification, like nutrient leaching and losses of soil carbon. This is another example of a different function of diversity. So these two figures are from research on nearly 100 farms in the US Corn Belt, and they show another benefit of agroecological practices. We calculated what are called nitrogen budgets or mass balances for 2 fields on each of these farms for over a 5-year period. And the yellow bars show the average annual surplus or excess nitrogen that isn't removed with harvested crops for different management practices. Fall and spring application of manure, surface broadcast of synthetic fertilizer, injection of anhydrous ammonia, and side dress applications of nitrogen fertilizer. The other bars are the nitrogen inputs and outputs at the field scale. The main takeaway here is that moderate inputs of manure applied in the spring and diversified rotations that include perennial forages and rotations with legumes as the main nitrogen source, these were all approximately in balance. So those practices were more efficient and less likely to lose nitrogen, which would go off either as a gas or to surrounding waterways. On the right, when we look at the individual fields that had some type of legume other than soybean in rotation, we found a negative relationship between the amount of nitrogen coming from legume nitrogen fixation and this indicator of sustainability, nitrogen balance. So this tells us that legumes are an especially efficient source of nitrogen because farms with more of their nitrogen from legumes have almost no surplus. So legume nitrogen sources are another example of managing plant diversity and ecological interactions to be able to reduce external or purchased inputs. Now, managing legumes for nitrogen is clearly riskier, right, than applying fertilizer because it depends on successful growth of the legume, which can then cause other challenges to deal with. We planted an on-farm experiment with cereal rye and hairy vetch cover crops on 10 diversified vegetable farms here in southeastern Michigan. And in this research, we wanted to measure nitrogen inputs from fixation on farms that grow hairy vetch. And across the farms, we found a really large range in the amount of nitrogen fixed by the vetch in mixture, which is the pink line, and when it was planted alone, which is the green line. It ranged from 0 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a really big range. And this shows that the amount of biomass is the main driver of nitrogen supplied by the legume cover. And on average, the vetch in mixture fixed nitrogen at a higher rate than when it was grown alone. And this is because rye takes up soil nitrogen and forces the vetch to rely more on its symbiotic relationship with bacteria to get its nitrogen. So this is another nice example of managing plant competition in an agroecosystem. What was exciting about this approach is that we were able to identify soil properties that explained some of this variable performance of the cover crop. So very low levels of soil phosphorus led to low vetch biomass, and soils that had really high soil fertility, like very high organic matter and high nitrogen content in the organic matter, had lower rates of nitrogen fixation by the legume. So as soil fertility builds, you can potentially invest less in expensive legume seed because the legume won't work as hard when the soil is very fertile. And they also become less competitive in mixtures as fertility increases. So this example shows how agroecology can inform how to manage functional diversity based on different soil conditions. And this is an area where we still need a lot more work. We also asked, well, how did the cover crop affect the soil on these farms? It was there for 2 full winter seasons, and all farms had the same rotation. And we found that biological indicators of soil health increased on average after the 2 years of the cover crop. And again, supporting the growing excitement about cover crops and soil health. This table shows that 3 standard soil test measures didn't change. So total soil organic matter didn't change in 2 years. This isn't very surprising because it usually takes time to detect changes in organic matter on farms. 2 chemical measures, plant available phosphorus and inorganic nitrogen, also didn't change. These inorganic nutrients, they cycle very quickly. So depending on when you measure them, they may not provide helpful information about overall fertility. In contrast, newer biological indicators of soil health, which are available in some soil health tests, those all did change. And I don't have time to get into the details now, but I'd be happy to say more about what these metrics are in the discussion. But overall, these are different measures that tell you about the quality of organic matter and about levels of biological activity in the soil. And those significantly increased with the cover crop. And I'll just quickly mention that in a separate study on these same farms, we found that mixtures of 2 to 4 cover crops that had contrasting traits, so like legumes, grasses, and brassicas, increased multiple functions more than just a sole planted cereal rye cover, which is the most common cover crop we have here in Michigan. Of course, different cover crops provide different functions, like shown here. So depending on management goals, it might make sense to plant just one of them if a particular function is really important. But having mixtures can increase multiple benefits at once, as long as the mixture successfully establishes and each species is actually growing, right, and producing some biomass. So cover crop mixtures, I think, are exciting because they're an opportunity to have intercropping on a lot of different types of farms, right, because they're not harvested. So building on these examples at the field and the farm scale, which can apply to many different types of farms, let's think about landscape scales. Agroecologists have found that landscapes that have a high quality patchwork of different land uses, diversified farms, rangelands, forests, prairie, unmanaged areas, can conserve wild biodiversity, right? Both within those habitats and also through movement of species among protected areas, remnant forests, other habitats, and along migratory routes or corridors, like shown in this picture of a silvopasture system in Colombia. So this shows the value of integrating biodiversity conservation into the landscapes we use, and not simply isolating many species to habitat islands. Maintaining biodiversity around fields supports other benefits, as you're probably aware. A recent synthesis of the literature, this Albrecht paper, found that flower strips adjacent to fields improved natural pest control in fields, and older strips that had more flower diversity had greater benefits for pollination. On the right, this image summarizes some research in Iowa, testing the effects of adding native prairie strips into cropped fields. And they found that these strips provide many benefits, increasing plant, pollinator, and bird species diversity and presence, while minimizing environmental pollution. Continuing to think at scale, if many farmers adopted agroecological practices in different ways across millions of acres, we could also reduce greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. Agricultural activities lead to carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, and main sources of those gases are listed in this table. So agriculture directly contributes 10 to 14% of the annual emissions that cause climate change, or up to 24% when lumped with forestry and other land uses, like in this chart. Other estimates that include emissions from agricultural expansion, the production of chemical inputs, and the supply chain, so processing, transport, refrigeration, those bring the total up to 26 to 36% of all human-caused emissions. So reducing agriculture's footprint and returning carbon to soil is really crucial to address climate change. Much of the direct emissions from production in North America are the result of nitrous oxide emissions from soil, especially with nitrogen fertilizer use, and methane loss from ruminant animals, and to some extent burned crop residues. Nitrogen fertilizer production is the greatest source of energy use in agriculture, mostly natural gas, and so it's a main driver of carbon dioxide emissions. So agroecology can reduce emissions through two main mechanisms. The first is by reducing use of fossil fuels, especially nitrogen fertilizer. And the second is building soil organic matter to store some carbon dioxide in the soil. This graph came from a long-term experiment at Kellogg Biological Station, which is a research site here in Michigan. It shows 4 agricultural systems in green, 2 systems that have perennials, continuous alfalfa forage and poplar trees in blue, and then 3 unmanaged treatments, which are early successional, mid-successional, and mature forest in orange. So researchers at this site calculated an overall global warming impact of all of the significant emissions coming from these systems over a 20-year period. So first, you can see the overall costs vary a lot with management. Here, negative bars or negative numbers are a good thing. The conventional system had a net annual global warming impact of 101. This is in grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per meter squared. The manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer and release of nitrous oxide were the 2 biggest causes of emissions in the conventional cropping system. The early successional system in orange that has rapidly growing perennial species, high rates of soil carbon accrual, that one's the most mitigating, negative 387. But this rate will diminish over time, as you can see in the mid and late successional bars. Of the annual cropping systems, the no-till and reduced chemical input systems led to small net reductions in emissions, while the agroecological system, which they call biologically based, it has no chemical inputs and cover crops, had the greatest mitigation potential of the cropping systems. So negative 124 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per meter squared. And this was due to increases in soil carbon and no fertilizer use. So this long-term experiment supports the potential for agroecology to reduce global warming. There's technically large potential to sequester carbon in soil organic matter through agroecological practices, like reducing soil disturbance, increasing plant biomass inputs, and increasing plant diversity. So photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide into organic carbon in plants. So it increases plant carbon stocks and reduces atmospheric CO2. And when those plants are then stored as increased soil organic matter in fields, it can keep carbon out of the atmosphere. Today, about 12% of ice-free land on Earth is cropland, and 38% is a combination of cropping and grazing. So soil carbon sequestration gained a lot of renewed attention with the 4 per mil initiative shown here on the right, which was signed by more than 100 nations at the 21st COP meeting in Paris in 2015. And the premise here is if we increase by 0.4% per year, that's 4 per mil, the quantity of carbon contained in soil, we can halt the annual increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is technically true, but there are many complexities, and this topic is part of a lot of contentious debates. A main weakness of this approach, at least to mitigating climate change, is that soil organic matter is susceptible to decomposition and re-release of that carbon dioxide with a big change in management practices. Soil will also eventually reach a new steady state, right? Carbon sequestration can't continue indefinitely. Future warming is also expected to reduce the potential for soil to store carbon because there are feedbacks that increase microbial decomposition. And of course, there are many social and political barriers to achieving this goal. That said, any carbon sequestered is a good thing, right? And there are many reasons to build soil organic matter. Soil organic matter, as shown on the left here, is just a really small proportion of all soil by mass, but it provides most of the functions of soil, including ones like nutrient cycling and disease suppression, which can support backing off of fossil fuel-based inputs over time.
Just a time check, Jennifer. You have 10 minutes to go.
Great, thank you. One benefit that I haven't discussed in detail yet is resilience to climate change. So agriculture not only causes emissions, but crop production and farm viability are really affected by global warming. And this recent analysis by Tim Bowles and colleagues, they summarized data from 11 of these long-term cropping systems experiments, like the one I showed in Michigan. And these were across the US and Canada, shown in this map on the right, spanning a precipitation gradient. And so they took all of these data from these 11 sites over many years and asked, how does crop rotation diversity, so including cover crops, small grains, forages, how does that affect corn yields over time and across these diverse growing conditions? And they found that more diverse rotations improved corn yields through time by 28% on average, including in favorable weather conditions. But importantly, in drought years, which we know are expected to increase, yield losses were much lower in diverse rotations than in monocultures, 11 to 89% lower, demonstrating the ability for agroecological practices to build resilience. I want to end with a brief discussion of transition processes. So thinking more broadly, well, how is it that farms move from simplified production systems to diversified, resilient agroecological practices? Hill and Gleesman and others have talked about three main stages of transitions that typically occur on farms, not necessarily in a linear fashion. The first is a shift towards improving input use efficiency, figuring out how to reduce input use. In this picture here, side dressing nitrogen fertilizer. The second stage is called input substitution. So starting to use new types of inputs. So an example of this is often certified organic farms that start to purchase organic approved inputs like copper fungicide or composted manure to provide functions compared to synthetic inputs. And then finally, the third system redesign phase is this stage where ecosystem processes and functions have mostly been restored, and farmers have accumulated new knowledge, new experience, so they can manage these species interactions rather than external inputs. I mentioned earlier that changes in total organic matter are often detectable after about 5 years or so. And this is a rough time frame that seems to correspond to going through these phases on a lot of farms. But understanding these ecosystem changes through time is really a key area where we need to know more. Just as one example, I've talked a lot about legume cover crops. So when exactly can farmers back off of nitrogen inputs from other sources, for example? What metrics would we want to monitor to know that more precisely? And same might go for other functions. I also want to share 2 examples of farmers' perspectives on this process from interviews we've conducted during on-farm work. So this first example is from a former tobacco farmer in southeastern Brazil who transitioned his farm to highly diversified vegetable production with the support of a regional farmer network and a government program that increased market access. So in this study, we found support for this idea that farms were in transition for a period of roughly 5 years. And this farmer said, our input use changed a ton, because in the beginning, we thought that the cost of transitioning would be high because you had to buy organic fungicides and insecticides, let's say. But today we see that we no longer need these things on our farm. In reality, you have to diversify. Good soil keeps the plant strong, so you don't need to be dumping on insecticide and those things. The second example is very similar. This is a farmer who was transitioning his farm to certified organic grain production in central Iowa. And he talked about how he was trying to deal with soybean aphids. His first approach was what we might call an input substitution one. He purchased 2 million ladybugs from a company in California, and he walked around flinging them on his soybean fields by hand. And he described how they pretty quickly fled for other habitats on his farm and said, and so the ladybugs all disappeared. So a couple $100, a good tuition. But following several years of reducing inputs and building crop diversity, he notes, now the ladybug population has naturally increased because there's so much more for them to eat. So it's not as hard to control soybean aphids as it used to be, but that first year was interesting. So of course it takes time for knowledge and for ecosystem interactions to start to work. In this case, a balance of predator-prey populations.
And Jennifer, we have 5 more minutes.
Perfect. Got 2 more slides. So even though the term agroecology first emerged from the field of ecology, newer definitions consider all disciplines that are relevant to farm sustainability. In the US and Canada, interest in sustainability is growing quickly, but agroecological practices are still rare, right? If we quantify them, it's somewhere between like 2 and 8% of total production. And this is because there are really large barriers to adopting these practices, mostly due to policy and market conditions that favor simplified commodity production. But other challenges like loss of knowledge about managing crop diversity, lack of equipment or processing infrastructure, and also social norms that favor high yields of commodity crops. So because of these barriers, agroecology needs to be based on sound scientific principles and also connect with movements that seek to change the dominant food system. So building on those previous quotes, there is clearly a particular need for financial and social support for farmers during the early years of transition, because it takes time to gain experience and the benefits to the agroecosystem take some time to appear, right? We need longer term thinking. And in this challenging context, farmer networks and organizations are really important, right, for helping to support adoption of new practices. And by working with groups of farmers who are successfully using these practices, we can figure out different pathways to agroecology. They tell us, how to shift investments more broadly to mobilize the resources that are needed for transitions to agroecology across millions of acres. So I'll conclude with just a few main messages. So agroecology as a science is relevant to all types of farms. We can understand how they work as ecosystems and how management practices lead to different outcomes that are either sustainable or not. And that knowledge is often generated by research in partnership with farmers, like on-farm studies, figuring out why or how farmer-led innovations improve sustainability, or using experiments on farms or at field stations that produce more generalizable information, like what controls rates of nitrogen supply from plants. Agroecological practices, so defined as applying ecological principles to management, improve sustainability, resilience, and regeneration of farm ecosystems, and they can contribute to mitigating climate change, especially by reducing input use and building soil organic matter. The social movement perspective reminds us that agroecology is part of a broader effort to change power relations that sustain simplified, environmentally destructive, and socially inequitable food systems. Local movements that are globally connected, like food sovereignty, have created new positive narratives about agroecology. So building on these efforts, there's really a need to cultivate strong alliances, for example, with urban and rural communities, to create space for beginning farmers, and to build pressure for the policy change that we need to support a sustainable future for everyone. So with that, I just want to quickly thank the farmer partners in this work, my lab manager, Beth Van Duzen, and the many student researchers who have supported a lot of these findings, some collaborators and funding. And thank you again for the nice invitation, and I look forward to our discussion.